In today's 7th Circle Gaming, we find out what happens when a developer attempts to combine turn-based tactical combat with superhero comics, which is a long way around of saying we're going to be analyzing Marvel Midnight Suns. We'll begin in the usual manner, and again you are invited to pause the video, or let's move right along. Now, in our first screenshot, we aim to illustrate what the game world looks like on its own, and a little bit about the user interface. There's really only two items on this particular exploration, for want of a better word, part of the game. There's just one item on the top left, and one item on the bottom right. And while we've ignored it long enough, we'll go ahead and mention that yes, there is a big press F to pay respects button in the center of the screen. We've included this in particular to illustrate the level of dialogue writing that the game has. In fact, there's even very early in the game a reference to the first Ghostbusters movie. Beyond that, the game world itself is particularly realistic and relatable. So then, let's move on to our next screenshot. This one is illustrative of what the turn-based tactical combat looks like. One wouldn't necessarily be far wrong to also describe this game as a card battling game, since, as you can see, there's a collection of cards at the bottom of the screen. There's also some environmental objects that player characters can interact with for a heroism cost. The heroism is, of course, displayed in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This is earned by knocking out opposition characters. So with that, let's move on to our next screenshot, which is illustrative of another major portion of the game, which is the story. This is a story cutscene. There are a couple of other ways to interact with the non-player characters, but this is just illustrative of one of the in-game cutscenes. So then, moving right along to the final main portion of the game, which is the crafting system. Now, this is just one of approximately 3 or 4 crafting systems that the game is going to have. We had to choose one, so we chose this one because it is the most obvious crafting system available. Mostly because this one also is going to be the only one that requires the player to go around the hub area searching out ingredients. And a fair number of the other ways of acquiring crafting ingredients are going to filter into this in some way. Now then, we need to move on to our first proper chapter, which is immersion. Here the game has earned a 4 out of 15. The game world is presented in a third-person perspective with realistic scenery and with the high fantasy element of superhero abilities. In addition, the game will be utilizing challenge to get players invested into the game world, in the sense that it has limited resources that players must earn by completing quests or missions. There is some tactical planning and some strategic planning that the game is going to present players with. Beyond that, the game will also be utilizing a story to attempt to get players invested into the game world, in that the in-game events are presented as part of this larger plot. Finally, the game will be utilizing player agency, and this is kind of a complicated point. Players are given the opportunity to shape their character development, to craft their appearance for in-game resources. So, if the player doesn't have the in-game resources, they can't engage with any of the customization. Players are also provided with the opportunity to select responses during conversations. Now, there's also an additional Achilles heel, if you will, to the player agency we'll discuss a little bit later. But for now, we need to move on to difficulty. For difficulty, Marvel Midnight Suns has earned a 7 out of 15. The game can be played equally well with a keyboard or gamepad. The user interface, as you saw earlier, in either the exploration or the turn-based tactical combat mode is uncomplicated. The key bindings are not unusual, and they do not require a significant period of adjustment. We uncovered no issues with hitbox detection or click detection or unusual sensitivity, let's say. There is some degree of random number generation, because as one might expect with any sort of card-based battling game, the order that the cards appear is completely randomly generated. On the other hand, the game has basic difficulty options really only, but the options and how they are going to affect the gameplay are provided with fairly complete descriptions, as complete as we've ever seen. So the game has earned a 7 out of 15 for that. Moving on to lasting appeal. Now, here the game has earned a 4 out of 15. What's really carrying this game are the two prongs of the satisfying turn-based tactical combat and the story interludes. The game doesn't have any mod support and only has cosmetic DLC. It being a story-based game will have limited replay value, and there's only one way to engage with the software. It will require the player to spend about 15 to 60 minutes for a play session, depending on what difficulty level that they're going to play with, to experience any progress through the story, etc., etc., or the other crafting systems. On the other hand, here, and get those grains of salt ready, players that have a particular affinity for a particular comic book character are going to find themselves somewhat let down, as of course this is not utilizing their movie actor voices. These are sound-alikes. In addition to that, the game very quick. To put it another way, the turn-based tactical missions very often have a time-sensitive element. So, a player must surrender their affinity for a particular character, be it Wolverine or Ghost Rider, etc., for which character produces the most damage per turn, to optimize their chances of completing the mission on time. With that very complicated and very convoluted point out of the way, let's move on to the overall score. Overall, the game has earned a 5 out of 15. We do suggest that the combat system is satisfying. The dialogue, while occasionally jokey and meme-laced, is interesting. The story and interacting with the other non-player characters will appeal to some players. The game occasionally does stop the game very hard for inescapable story interludes. At the end of the in-game day, the player must go to sleep. There is no way of avoiding that. And occasionally certain activities will be locked off until the story is engaged with. Which is another way of saying this is a game that the developers want players to spend a significant amount of time with. Midnight Suns has a limited pool of characters, and once again it can seem slow-paced. in that the hub areas open fairly slowly. It took us about 8 to 10 hours to unlock a majority of the hub area interactions. As we said earlier, too, any affinity that a player has for a particular character is going to very quickly need to be replaced by what is the optimum for a particular mission. And with that, we will say thank you very much for tuning in. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, this is the end. Do all the other YouTube things, and from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.